So hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 14 years of experience as a social worker and 5 years as a therapist. In this video I'm covering aspects of the Cain and Abel story. It's a biblical story of the sons of Adam and Eve. And I'm going to apply Bowen family therapy lens as well as the interpretation from Jordan Peterson, who's a clinical psychologist and has spoken quite a bit on the topic of psychological interpretation of biblical stories. And then I'm also going to pull from Sam Vaknin in terms of understanding of narcissism and how it shows up in the dynamic of the family. I'll also pull from the movie Mother, which is a fairly popular movie that came out about, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. I'll be pulling from different accounts, interpreting various aspects of narcissistic family dynamics, pulling primarily from Cain and Abel's story in terms of how the Cain attacked Abel in terms of murdering him and or ending his life, and how that led to him attacking the ideal. So part one, the metaphysics of resentment, the Cain and Abel archetype. So the narrative of Cain and Abel comes from Genesis 4 and is not merely a religious text, but the archetypical blueprint of civil rivalry and the psychological destructions of the ideal. Jordan Peterson had an analysis of Cain and Abel, and he positions the myth as a fundamental catastrophe of human interactions. In Jordan Peterson's psychological understanding and interpretation, Cain and Abel represents two distinct modes of being in the world. So Abel, according to him, is characterized as the harmonious alignment with the ideal. His sacrifices are accepted by God because they are offered with a spirit of humility and rectitude, whereas in Abel is embodiment of success, competence, and the proper orientation towards the divine, according to Jordan Peterson.
Adam and Eve are not the first two human beings. Cain and Abel are the first two human beings. Because Adam and Eve were made by God and they were born in paradise. It's like, what kind of human beings are those? You don't know any human beings like that. Human beings aren't born in paradise and made by God. Human beings are born of other human beings, right? And so that's the first thing. And it's post-fall. We're out in the world. We're out in history now. We're not in some archetypal beyond, although we are still to some degree, not to the degree that was the case with the story of Adam and Eve. We've already been thrown out of the garden. We're already self-conscious. We're already awake. We're already covered. We're already working. We're full-fledged human beings. And so you have the first two human beings. Present the first man as a murderer of his brother is something that should really set you back on your heels. And again, she bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. But in any case, the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering. So there's a hint that Abel's putting a little bit more into the whole sacrificial thing than Cain. But there's also a hint that maybe God is just liking you a little better than he's liking him. And that's, I think, useful from a literary perspective because there is that arbitrariness about life.
Cain, conversely, represents the corrupt mode of being, characterized by arrogance, deceit, and refusal to take responsibility for his own insufficiency. So the psychological crisis emerges not from Cain's failure, but from his observation of Abel's success. Peterson argues that the existence of the ideal, that's Abel, serves as an unspoken judge of the insufficient in Cain. Abel does not need to speak or criticize Cain. His mere existence and acceptance of his sacrifice highlights Cain's inadequacy. So you can also understand this within narcissistic family dynamics. If you have a sibling, you could apply having an older brother maybe or a younger brother. But basically, they, not even something you've said, although they will probably say that you've said certain things and are justified to have this complaint or this treatment towards you. But obviously deep down they're resentful. And you represent the ideal. If you're the scapegoat, you have a proper orientation towards the ideal and the goodness of life. And then you have a brother who has resentment towards you simply for representing that ideal. And so that's just an understanding of the Cain and Abel story, and just how Cain essentially ends the life of his brother. God comes down on him, and he's, am I my brother's keeper? So in an act of defiance, he asks that to God. And so it's just interpreting that with the Cain doesn't think he has any obligation or responsibility for his actions, or doesn't take any responsibility. And he's willing to sacrifice his brother because his brother represents an ideal and something with principle and goodness, and is more alignment with God. And so instead of Cain taking responsibility and having a proper orientation in life, out of his resentment, he ends the life of his brother, and then God sends him to the city of Nod. Cain chooses to end the life of his brother, and the ending of Abel is interpreted by Peterson not as simply an act of jealousy, but as a metaphysical rebellion. By ending the favored brother, Cain attempts to blind the eye of God that distinguishes between good and quality. He seeks to drag the world down to the level of shared misery, where his own mediocrity is no longer conspicuous. In the narcissistic family, this dynamic is ubiquitous. The scapegoat is frequently targeted not because they are bad, but because they possess a quality, integrity, empathy, and vitality that the narcissistic parent or sibling within the dysfunctional family lacks. So the scapegoat is the Abel, whose light casts the harsh shadow on the parent's deadness, necessitating their destruction or expulsion to preserve the parent's fragile ego. You can apply Jordan Peterson's interpretation to the Cain and Abel story and understand it from the resentment in terms of the way in which a brother may be within a narcissistic family system, or it could be your sister, how they have a rebellion against the metaphysics of your existence because you represent the ideal. Instead of taking responsibility and turning towards, maybe it's their own conscience, or if you a believer in religion or of God, then turning towards God, they rebel metaphysically against you for simply having qualities that they don't currently practice or are incorporating and nurturing in themselves. So you might try to have that conversation with your brother, but if they have this metaphysics rebellion and they resent you, and a lot of my clients have spoken about that, where their sibling very much resents them simply for being alive, they might tie it to some content in the sense that it could be the case that maybe the parents weren't expecting to have a child, and so it's seen within the myth of the family or the way in which the sibling interprets it as though you weren't meant to be alive. But I would say that typically it's even deeper than that, in the sense that they have this metaphysic rebellion, and the narcissistic family, if someone's narcissistic, has this turning away from the goodness of life. And they basically reject God or the spirit and believe that there's no obligation to their brother. As the phrase in the Bible goes in Genesis, am I my brother's keeper? So I think, as I've spoken in other videos, but the scapegoat is marked by the family as identified patient, and essentially they are the garbage can of the family, and need to be ostracized or projected upon to protect the fragile ego of the narcissist and maintain the equilibrium of the narcissistic family unit. Peterson provides a mythological interpretation of the Bible using psychological principles. Bowen would see it more from the family system, so the family is an emotional unit. So Peterson would provide the why of this interpretation of using Cain and Abel as a myth and a story, and Bowen would provide the how. So how does this actually occur within the narcissistic family? Bowen understands the family not as a group of separate individuals, but rather as an emotional unit. So he would consider it a single organism where anxiety flows like electricity across the circuits of the relationship. So Bowen posited that every family generates a certain level of chronic anxiety. This anxiety arises from external stressors. It could be financial stress, health, and internal instability within the family. So it could be marital conflict, a level of emotional immaturity, When this anxiety exceeds the system's capacity to bind it, the system seeks to target to offload the tension. So this is to use the hydraulic model of emotional necessities. So the hydraulic model of emotion necessitates a vessel. So this is the scapegoat. So essentially the circuit breaker that gets the anxiety within the system. They need to find an identified patient, and typically that is the scapegoat. And so the anxiety, it gets projected on to a child, typically as to distract from the anxiety or the stress within the system. And so instead of it being, let's work on our marriage, it's our child has this behavior and we need to work on our child through the expectations of the parent. They will tend to internalize and take on that role as that projection from the parents or from the family to maintain that attachment. And this can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. The child believes they have a behavior, or if they're more of a low energetic person with a certain disposition, they might be seen as depressed or having psychological issues. If they're more hyper, it could be the case that they're aggressive or acting out. So essentially, the parents will find an identified patient to offload their anxiety and project on the child. And then the child will interpret that in order to maintain that attachment with their parent, will start taking on that role and that projection, and essentially have a self-fulfilling prophecy. The identified patient is the individual who absorbs this systemic anxiety. In a high conflict marriage, for instance, spouses may avoid addressing their incompatibility by focusing their shared anxiety on a child. We don't have a marriage problem, we have a child problem, they will say. This systemic need unconsciously accommodates the parents by developing symptoms, behavioral issues, depression, or addiction. These symptoms confirm the parent's projection and justify the continued focus on the child, thereby stabilizing the legal craft in the marital foundation. So essentially, there's a crack within the family to some degree. Instead of the parents addressing that and looking at themselves, they will project onto a child, and then that child, especially when they're young and impressionable, will take on that interpretation and projection and start to show symptoms that mirror what the parent is expecting of them. The parents will pit the siblings against each other and create this divide so they can't join together and rebel against the tyranny of the parent. They're in this competition, ongoing competition for favor in terms of being the golden child and not being the scapegoat or the lost child. And so essentially the parent will pit the siblings against each other. And this is what also gives rise to the notion of this Cain and Abel archetype, where your sibling is metaphysically rebelling essentially against God or the universe because you represent the ideal. Certainly, not all of us are perfect, of course, but it's most likely if you're an empath and a scapegoat, you had more alignment with truth and goodness in your life. Your sibling, who has more the archetype of Cain, is resentful towards you because simply by your ideal reflection, they're resentful for that because it shows them not in a good light. Instead of improving themselves, they look to end your soul and erase your identity, essentially, because of your representation of the ideal. So also within narcissistic family dynamics, there is triangles, and typically it's a narcissistic parent creating a triangle. So they have a dyad, so a relationship, it could be with an enabling parent or another narcissistic parent, or it could be also the sibling. In this triangle, they will pit you against your sibling. Typically there's a rescuer, so they will play the victim, and then an enabling parent won't really help you, but essentially just want to keep the peace and will want you to apologize or make amends with your narcissistic parent or sibling. They don't honor your truth or the truth of what actually occurred, but rather it's all about maintaining the homeostasis of the family. And an interesting movie with regards to this is Mother. That movie it's with Jennifer Lawrence and other great actors. The movie uses a lot of allegories from the Bible, and she's essentially the scapegoat in that movie. And I would say it's a very dark movie, especially at the end. There's been some controversy around one of the scenes at the end. So I would caution you if you don't want to be shocked or disturbed. But the movie generally is a very dark and intense movie, I would say, dramatic. But it has like Cain and Abel's story within that movie with these two brothers, what occurs within the beginning scenes of that movie. I won't give it too much away, but she's essentially the scapegoat, and the poet, which is her husband, she's always sacrificing and giving towards him. He's the narcissist of the family, and the head patriarchy seen as a pseudo god, or it's just interesting dynamics, and he likes to have people in the house and guests in terms of adulation and narcissistic supply. But the Jennifer Lawrence, the scapegoat in that movie, essentially just wants to have a connection with her husband and have a family. But yet these people are invited to the home, and so there's a lot of chaos. And so there's different principles you can apply to the Cain and Abel story. But I would certainly recommend that if you're interested in just exploring this dynamic within a cinematic perspective. Essentially, though, I wanted to talk about how Cain and Abel can be applied to this deep-seated resentment that can occur between siblings, particularly if it's a brother, and how it's not so much about you, so it's not personal. It's really that they resent the ideal and need you to erase you and do away with you, essentially. That's why they most likely will align with the narcissistic parent and will ensure that you're essentially erased or that you're ended in some sense. And maybe in more extreme situations, they actually physically do that, but you could just understand it psychologically and with your reputation. They likely want to completely erase you. They have certain ways they try to smear your name. I wanted to explore that and use Jordan Peterson in terms of the clinical psychologist. And in Maps of Meaning and other books, he interprets the Cain and Abel story. It was a helpful understanding of this original myth from Genesis and how you can apply it to the narcissistic family system, particularly with a sibling who has deep-seated resentment towards you. It's more about a metaphysical rebellion, about you representing the ideal, and them not taking responsibility, aligning themselves with truth and goodness. Sam Vaknin posits that the narcissist was essentially, it's a result of childhood neglect or abuse. And so he talks about the theory that personality structure of narcissism is a defense against early trauma, suggesting that narcissists choose to sacrifice. So the child basically sacrifices the true self for the false self. It's a defense against early childhood trauma, although he is open to genetic predisposition for narcissism. He talks about narcissism being a choice. He suggests that narcissists choose to sacrifice their true self to survive, becoming a human doing and not a human being. They perpetuate this choice daily by refusing to acknowledge reality. So it's a person in denial of reality and sacrificing their true self for their false self. And essentially, if that's your parent or sibling, they're expecting that you do the same for them. They also have an aversion towards reality. Understand Cain is that he's very much denying reality and God, essentially. But Sam Vaknin would caution against the scapegoat coming involved in a victim trap. He talks about the sense that the scapegoat can develop a victim identity. He argues that scapegoats often become addicted to their own victimization, as it provides a moral high ground and a defined identity in the absence of a true self. If the scapegoat defines himself solely in opposition to the narcissist, they remain in a binary system, trapped in the narcissistic binary system, essentially. To heal, the scapegoat must relinquish the scapegoat and victim label and the desire for the parent's validation, accepting that the parent is incapable of change. Often, when you're the scapegoat in a family dynamic, it's natural to first be in righteous rage and to be in a place of first denial and then shock. And then when you move towards ultimately acceptance, the notion of radical acceptance, you typically go through a journey. It's hard not to become, in some sense, according to Sam Vaknin, adopt a certain victim stance, because essentially you are a victim, but then obviously you don't want to over-identify with any label. I think it's good to know what you went through in terms of your abuse, in terms of what you received growing up. But then at the same time, you don't want to get in what, according to Sam Vaknin, talks about the narcissist binary and see you as all good and like the all good victim, and then this evil monster, essentially. And the victim label and desire for the parent's validation is something that he says it's hard for people to tend to get over. Sam Vaknin also talks about the dead mother complex. He pulls from Andre Green, psychoanalysis concept, and Vaknin describes a narcissist as suffering from a dead mother complex, a mother who is physically present but emotionally disassociated. And not only emotionally disassociated, but emotionally deceased. So depressed, disassociated, or essentially narcissistic. Future narcissist in the family creates a false self to animate the mother or to fill the void she left. In other videos, I've talked about the narcissist as being a void, a black hole. It's yelling into a void. There's also the notion of a dead mother. And I don't know if Sam Vaknin would necessarily describe it as a father being a dead mother. He applies it more to the actual mother. But if you take his dual mothership model, all narcissists create this duality of wanting you to mother them. They regress you to a younger part and mother you essentially, and idolize you like a mother would. And so he just talks about the dead mother and how it could be the case that a sibling has a certain emotional fusion with the one child, grooming that child to become a future narcissist. And so that son or daughter creates a false self to animate the dead mother. That parent is essentially not emotionally available, and there is no way you can have an authentic connection with your mom or father if they're narcissistic. They're physically there, but not psychologically or emotionally there. If you take the notion that the narcissist is semi-psychotic, their reality testing is off, and they emotionally and psychologically fuse with their nearest and dearest in terms of their family. And in terms of the scapegoat, sees the truth of the parent's emptiness, and they usually find it very terrifying. The parent essentially must destroy the scapegoat's perception to maintain the illusion of their own vitality. The scapegoat is the witness to the spiritual crime of the parent's self-murder. The scapegoat is the witness to the spiritual crime of the parent's self-erasure. Essentially, the narcissistic mother or father has to maintain this illusion of their false self. The scapegoat has witnessed this psychological erasure of their parent and the void or emptiness, whereas the enabling or the child that's the golden child and is grooming to become a narcissist, essentially within that void animates it and creates their own sense of self-importance, and their false self is elevated. But typically it's under this void in terms of this dead mother aspect. The scapegoat sees this emptiness and maybe at first tries to communicate and have an authentic connection, but the void, there's nothing there in terms of a self. There's just a masquerading of personas and different snapshots, not really a continuity of self. So there's a splitting of the psyche, and the false self manifests in a variety of different ways. But your golden child, or maybe a lost child, could be different roles within the family, as well as a parent who's an enabling parent. They animate that void and push their false self as well. So Vaknin further elaborates on the system of residuals, where a collapsed narcissist may oscillate between overt and covert states. This manifests as a parent who plays the victim to the outside world while being a tyrant at home, so having overt tendencies. This dissonance is maddening for the scapegoat, who is gaslit by the community. Your mother is a saint, and the parents inside are covert, and garners sympathy from others, but in the home they're aggressive and offload their shame onto the scapegoat. The child is essentially trapped between the parent's public mask and the private face. I mentioned the movie Mother from 2017. You could see this as the dance or the tension between the empath and the narcissist. So this is an allegorical film, provides a harrowing depiction of the narcissist and the empath dynamic. So there's the poet, and he represents the narcissist, a godlike figure. He is obsessed with his work and the adulation of strangers, so narcissistic supply. And then there's the mother, so that's Jennifer Lawrence, and she represents the scapegoat and Earth. She builds the home, the family system, and gives everything to support the poet, the narcissist. There's a cycle of depletion in the movie. The poet invites strangers into the home who disrespect and destroy it. The mother protests, but the poet ignores her boundaries because he craves a stranger's worship. This mirrors the covert narcissist parent who allows outsiders to abuse the family or ignores the scapegoat's need to maintain a public image. Ultimately, the poet sacrifices the mother's baby to the crowd and then extracts the mother's heart itself. It is a visual representation of soul erasure, the total consumption of the scapegoat's essence to fuel the narcissist ego. So I would definitely encourage you to check out that movie, Mother. It's a very intense movie. I would caution you, it is quite disturbing, I would say, at the end. But it's something that you wanted to reflect on in terms of this dynamic. How do you essentially exit this role? So this is the path of the escape, the hero's journey, and no contact. The exit from the role of the scapegoat is a psychological odyssey that parallels Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. It is not merely a physical relocation, but a reconstruction of the psyche. The call usually comes in the form of a crisis or a breakdown, a realization of abuse, or a betrayal that can no longer be denied. So the scapegoat realizes the family system is a soul erasure machine. The initial reaction is refusal to the call. Typically, the scapegoat will refuse the call and is bound by the trauma bond. By intermittent reinforcement of the narcissistic parent or family, they're essentially in this trauma bond, and there's a calling in typical movie in the hero's journey. There's a call, but at first there's a sense that the hero has a level of foolishness, but also cowardliness, and they resist the call, typically. You grow up in the system, you're the scapegoat, and then you have a trauma bond with your family or your parent, and you're in some sense denial or repressed it. But then you come to a crisis and you essentially have to make a decision. And if you resist that over time, your body starts to affect it, like your health. That's something to think about. Also, your success or the ability to be present in your relationships in terms of differentiation could be seen as the resistance to this call. Essentially, the guilt instilled by the family projection process. So that's also a key aspect of this is the projection process and the guilt that the scapegoat internalizes, which prevents them from essentially setting boundaries and moving forward in their life. The superego of the scapegoat sounds like the parent's voice. So the scapegoat has usually an interject of a superego. So the superego is the way in which we guide our life and the way we want to be perceived in terms of like our persona and the perception of others, and just like staying to rules and morals and to certain ways to operate in the world. And so essentially the superego of the scapegoat sounds like the parent's voice, warning them that leaving is a sin. So there's this sense that if you leave the family or don't go along with your parent, you're sinning, and there's this internalized guilt. You're seen as betraying and not being loyal to the family simply for being yourself or setting boundaries. At some point you cross the threshold, the decision to go no contact. Going no contact is the crossing of the threshold. The moment the scapegoat steps out of the ordinary world, the dysfunction, into the special world, the unknown of independence. In terms of Vaknin's insight, he would argue that no contact is essential because the narcissist is an addiction. Any contact resets the cycle of abuse. The scapegoat must accept that the good parent they hope for is a fantasy that never existed. They must grieve the dead mother and accept the reality of the void. That takes some work, but I would say that's the core practice and healing journey to understand it's like a form of an addiction. I think you can see this typically more in a romantic situation, but when it's your family, there's a lot of confusion because it's core to your human nature and to who you are as a person. From a young age, your wires almost got crossed because you have a trauma bond. There's also a lot of internalized guilt and the superego in terms of you have these interjects likely of your parents who are narcissistic. But by grieving the notion of the good parent and the recognition of the dead mother, you come to terms with essentially going no contact. So typically when you do this, there's an extinction burst. When the scapegoat leaves, the family system destabilizes. The anxiety that was shunted in the scapegoat now floods into the system of the family. The family will react with an extinction burst, so a massive spike in aggression, love bombing, or a smear campaign to force the scapegoat back into the role. There will be a strong reaction, particularly when you go no contact, and there will typically be a collapse of the narcissist and the narcissistic family as well, because you were providing that equilibrium in the family. In terms of understanding the other part of this too is just the abyss and the shadow. So this is interpretation from Carl Jung. The period immediately following no contact is the belly of the whale. It is usually characterized by intense grief, loneliness, and doubt. According to Jung, Carl Jung, he would talk about integration. This is where the deep work occurs. The scapegoat must confront their own shadow. They must acknowledge the resentment, the rage at the injustice, and the desire for revenge.
You can have some sympathy for Cain. If you don't have any sympathy for Cain, then you're not. See, Cain and Abel also, they don't just represent two archetypal types of being. They represent. So it's not like you're Cain and you're Abel and you're Cain and you're Abel. It's like you're half and half and you're half and half and you're half and half. It's something like this. This is two different potential patterns of destiny. And you don't manifest one purely and the other zero. It's like it's like the line between good and evil that runs down the human heart. It's exactly the same idea. And maybe you're more like Cain or maybe you're more like Abel, but there's still a little Cain in you no matter how able you are. And maybe more than a little. And probably more than a little. And if you watch your fantasies, which I would very much recommend, you'll find that they show you dark things about you that will shock you if you allow yourself to be conscious of what you're thinking. So it's a good time when you're having an argument with someone, especially someone that you love, to just watch the pictures that flash in the back of your mind. That's part of, let's say, coming into contact with what Carl Jung called the shadow. And the shadow is the manifestation of Cain. That's a perfect way of thinking about it. And one of the things that Jung said about the shadow, because Jung was not someone you mess around with lightly, he said the human shadow has roots that reach all the way to hell.
If they deny this rage, they remain tethered to the family. By integrating the shadow, I'm capable of monstrous rage, but I choose not to act on it. They achieve individuation. They stop being an anti-narcissist and start being a self. There's a time and place for grief in terms of processing your narcissistic family and the way that your parent mistreated you. And I would say that there's not like a defined timeline necessarily how that occurs. I would say there's the notion of prolonged grief and typically a lot of memories and your own somatic and psychological processing that you need to go through, and also the righteous rage. But then go no contact. It's also recognizing what Sam Vaknin says about not overly identifying with this role of being the scapegoat and finding yourself essentially. I think though at times it's good to have these labels and definitions to understand what you've been through and to have that experience. But then once you've grieved that, essentially you need to grieve that and not over-identify with being a victim of the narcissistic family or parent. Part of that was also integrating your own shadow in terms of your own Cain, so your own resentment, your own seeking revenge, your own sense of injustice, and you focus on creating a more dynamic in yourself of Abel in terms of living up to your ideals and the better angels of our nature. And according to Carl Jung, it would also be integrating your shadow, doing your best to integrate that so that you can essentially individuate as a person. The ultimate goal is not just survival, but breaking the multi-generational transmission process. So that's take a Bowen concept. So by differentiating from the family ego mass, the scapegoat ensures that they do not pass the anxiety onto their own children. They essentially become a circuit breaker for the intertransmission process of the lineage. So stopping the lack of differentiation and creating a healthier branch on the family tree that's no longer in some sense poisoned or deteriorating, but essentially a healthy branch that is independent, like on the roots of the tree, so that it's a solid foundation in terms of the earth, and you could consider like the sky or the stars. So that branch is solid to the tree. So they become the circuit breaker essentially. And Jordan Peterson notes that the antidote to Cain's spirit is assumption of responsibility. So by taking on responsibility, the scapegoat takes responsibility for their own life, their own healing, and let the resentment of the past dictate. So they don't let the resentment of the past dictate their future. And I think that's very key for us. And that takes grieving and processing memories. But essentially, by taking on responsibility for yourself and your life, I think that's what you're doing in terms of going against the nature of being like a Cain-like spirit in you, in terms of an archetype, understanding an Abel aspect of us. And that's the thing is like we've went through this likely in our family of origin, and it's necessary to acknowledge what occurred, obviously, and be upset about that and have a level of righteous rage about it. I think we can see it in others, but we also have to understand ourselves too, not over-identifying or becoming a prolonged victim of this situation or allowing the past to dictate our future, but rather owning and taking responsibility in our life. Then we're acting more in that able nature of ourselves. So in this video, I talked about different aspects of the journey, the Cain and Abel story as the main motif. I mentioned Jordan Peterson and his analysis of that story, and also the movie Mother, and ways in which that movie represents aspects of this dynamic. I brought in Bowen and Sam Vaknin, and in terms of Sam Vaknin, I talked about ways in which he talks about not overly identifying with being the scapegoat or a victim of the narcissist, and doing our best to integrate our shadow to take Carl Jung. So if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.